As a preliminary matter, I am Martha Taylor, the planning director, standing in for Peter Pecos, the chair of the Newbury Planning Board, confirming that all members and persons anticipated are present and can hear me. So Leslie Matthews.
Here.
Woody Knight.
Here.
Mary Stone.
Here.
All right, and hopefully Pete will join us. I'm here, and then David Maxon.
Here.
And this is a January 13th work group of the Newbury Planning Board focusing on developing revisions to our wireless bylaw. And this work group meeting is being conducted remotely, consistent with the act relative to extending certain COVID-19 measures adopted during the state of emergency, which extends the governor's March 12, 2020 order suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law, GL chapter 3820 until April 1st, 2022. This order suspends the requirement of the open meeting law to have all meetings in a publicly accessible physical location and allows public bodies to meet entirely remotely, so long as reasonable public access is afforded so that the public can follow along with deliberations of the meeting. For this work group meeting, the work group is convened by video conference via Zoom, as posted on the agenda, which can be found on the town's website, and identifies how the public may join. You may join us by going to HTTP Zoom US and entering meeting ID 832-7141-3056 or by calling 1-929-205-6099 and entering the meeting ID number when prompted. The meeting is being recorded and attendees are participating by video and telephone conference. Recording will be available on the Newbury Access YouTube channel. Materials have been provided to the board members prior to the meeting for review. We're not anticipating any public comments, so I won't go through the instructions on how to do that. So if there are any votes taken, any recommendations that the work group wants to make, they will be conducted by roll call vote. So that said, just a brief introduction. David worked with us previously, trying to get the bylaw revisions ready for town meeting. We have a draft that's dated March 3rd, 2020. And I think what we are going to do today is just sort of go through that, and I'm going to turn it over to David just to kind of discuss the assumptions that we made at the time, the recommendations and questions that he had. I did send out to all of you again a copy of the markup of the suggested bylaw revisions, because there were a lot of comments and questions in the margins, which David had made, which need to be, which were addressed in the revisions, but may want to be considered again, reconsidered, whatever. So I think, David, if I can turn it over to you.
Okay. I'm grabbing my copy of the markup from February 24th with your notes and my replies.
All right, and I can also put that up on the screen if that would be helpful.
Well, I think if I do it, if I can share a screen, I can
okay, let me enable you to do that.
do the scrolling. Let's see.
Okay, so you should be set to do that now.
All right. Let's see if that works. All right, so you're looking at my screen or just the window, the Microsoft Word window?
So we've got your screen, some of your comments. Yeah, actually, I'm just going to minimize my thing here. So your yeah.
Okay, so yeah, hi. Towns approach regulating wireless communication services in a couple of ways. One is with an overlay district where they try to predict where towers will be needed and create, in essence, select parcels or groups of parcels, or in some cases, entire zoning districts like an industrial district as being a place where you can put a new cell tower. And it's a pretty common approach. The difficulty with that is that you have to stay ahead of the carriers in guessing where they're going to need towers next, and you may need to modify your overlay district repeatedly, or you may need to have a second layer in your bylaws that allow you to consider applications in other locations when the overlay district doesn't work for an applicant. The other approach is to simply skip the overlay district and on the one hand, let them put a tower anywhere they want to propose to put a tower, but have a very strict criteria for placing facilities, not just towers, but facilities on buildings and stuff like that, so that it's safer to say no when the entire town is technically available for wireless facilities. Some towns have gotten boxed into a corner because they said no to something not in an overlay district, and the court said, well, your overlay district isn't very good. You need to say yes. So towns like Wellesley have been very successful with not having an overlay district. But what they are is they're just really militant about their planning performance standards and enforcing their expectations for what a facility will look like and do to the community. Generally, when you have a bylaw that's already written, most of the towns I work with prefer to try and just change it rather than reinvent the wheel unless the wheel's really broken. So in your case, you have an overlay district, which let's see what we have proposed here.
Yeah, our existing overlay district basically is our business in the light industrial district, which
Right.
goes from the Newbury-Newburyport boundary at the traffic circle on Route 1 down to Boston Road.
Okay, and it's often the case that your non-residential districts are not evenly distributed around the town, so wireless carriers will need to put facilities in residential districts. So the trick here is to just not paint yourself into a corner where if you can avoid it, forcing a carrier to apply to zoning for a variance and then to planning for a special permit, because that then gets into a tug of war sometimes, where the carrier will come in and say, well, we got a variance, so you have to grant us a permit. When in fact it's the planning board that really has the qualifications for reviewing an application and not getting strong-armed by having a variance being put in front of you.
And if I may interrupt here, currently the way our bylaw is set up, the ZBA is actually the special permit granting authority.
Oh, it is. Good point. Thank you for reminding me. All right, so that issue is a non-issue.
So I think we may have been suggesting to change that in the revisions we were making to this, but that's the way it is right now.
Right. Good. So some of the changes that we proposed here are to kind of align the language, one thing, to the way the FCC looks at things. And another is that oftentimes when bylaws were originally written, there would be some kind of mashing of the concept of a tower and the concept of a wireless communications facility. Those in fact are two different things. So you'll see some places here where I've added tower and stricken facility and that sort of thing. To kind of explain that, maybe I'm covering things you're familiar with, but a wireless communications facility is anything that provides wireless communications to the public with an antenna and some equipment connected to the antenna. That can be on a tower, it can be on a rooftop, it can be on a utility pole. So those are all wireless communications facilities. Then things break into smaller categories. There is this separate thing the FCC has done with what are called small wireless facilities. If their antennas and their radio equipment are smaller than a certain volume, generally it's for use of the public way to put them on utility poles. And those generally are not zoning related issues. Those are things that the department responsible for regulating the public way, which is usually the Board of Selectmen, review those applications for small wireless facilities in the public way.
And is that where a grant of location comes in?
And that would be functionally a grant of location under the FCC rubric. The town of Burlington went so far as to set up a set of design criteria that both the Board of Selectmen can use on the public way and the planning board in Burlington can use when a small wireless facility is proposed on private property. And that's kind of handy. There are certain things you can and cannot do to control small wireless facilities. That's why the FCC created this different category. But back to probably the big issue in town right now, which is the where they're going to put the next tower. So we've proposed some language to kind of tighten things up and reduce ambiguity. And short of reading each one of these set of changes, I hope that if you haven't, you might take an opportunity to read the red line to see what my proposed changes look like and to try to understand why. So if that's, I don't know if that's something any of you have looked at already, and if you have any questions, so it might be a good time to talk about them.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody's got any questions.
Okay, so and getting back to my introduction regarding overlay districts versus not. In fact, we are proposing that facilities are permitted in all districts, but we have new tower-based wireless facilities limited to the overlay district. So what we've done is allowed them to attach to a building rooftop or some other existing structure outside of the overlay district, which is a good thing. And if they're going to build a new tower, they should focus on the overlay district to the extent that the district works. Noise, I've touched up on the noise language. Got into an issue with noise in Hull last year. It was for a small wireless facility, part of a distributed antenna system mounted on utility poles in Hull, where the infrastructure company, Extenet, was proposing new poles, new installations on poles along the beach road. And they're really close to residences and they have fans. And we went back and forth on noise generation with that. Generally, cell sites are remote enough that the fan noise they make is not obnoxious to folks in residential areas. What else do we have? Okay, just the processes of doing balloon tests, crane tests, those sorts of things to make sure that the record is complete with a visual impact analysis that's reliable. One thing, I'm not sure where we touch on it here in these edits, but the Telecommunications Act of 1996, you may be familiar with. To summarize, the town cannot deny an application where the denial would have the effect of prohibiting the provision of personal wireless services. And there's a couple of decades of case law now describing what is an effective prohibition and what isn't. So what towns often, boards often do is hire independent parties like myself to review the application and to look for the two ingredients in what would cause an effective prohibition if you said no to the application. And one ingredient is there a significant gap in service? There usually is. It may not be what a gap was 20 years ago, but they still have ways of arguing they have a gap in service. And the second one is, are there alternatives that are, in some courts, it's alternatives that are less intrusive to the purpose and intent of the bylaw. Not obtrusive visually, but less intrusive to the purpose and intent of the bylaw. And that's where you might then have your expert look at some other parcels for an alternate location for the tower, or can the tower be relocated on the parcel to reduce usually the concern is visual impact, to make it look less imposing, or to have it protect a scenic skyline, those kinds of things, or just be farther away from neighbors so it's not as obnoxious to them. Also, the Telecommunications Act says that you can't regulate the placement of the facility based on the radio emissions. Of course, there are a lot of people who are concerned about exposure to radio waves, but the FCC has standards in place, and the Congress said you must rely on the FCC standards. You can't make up your own standards. So one of the things that's usually pro forma that we do during an application process is review the applicant's calculations that demonstrate the facility will be safe, that it will comply with the FCC's limits for protecting the public from excessive levels of radio energy.
Excuse me, David, can I ask you a question?
Please.
What actually does that mean? Is that a health issue that is pervasive, that you have a radio wave that interferes with people's health, I guess? Is that what it is?
Yeah, that's, to be as polite as I can, that's the belief.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Like,
Yeah.
sort of
I'm a member of the International Committee on Electromagnetic Safety. It just revised its standard for public and occupational exposure to radio waves in the end of 2019. And this involves a systematic review of the scientific literature and all of that stuff. And that standard is still pretty close to what the FCC is requiring. And what it is that the science strongly demonstrates that at really high levels of exposure, like what I do for a living, I walk on rooftops in front of broadcast antennas transmitting thousands of watts of power. You have a thermal effect that can cause discomfort or injury. And the safety limits are to, with a big margin of safety, prevent any thermal effects from occurring to the general public. People argue that there's more than just a thermal effect. There's a low-level non-thermal effect. And they'll quote some scientific studies that come up with some conclusion that mice exposed to low-level energy got this condition, or that people who use cell phones get certain kinds of diseases more than others. But when you look at the totality of the science, and that's what you have to do, you can't cherry pick studies that favor your point of view. When you look at the totality of the science, and organizations like the World Health Organization do this on a regular basis, there is no demonstrable adverse health effect to the kinds of radio wave levels that we experience. We're all experiencing right now, sitting in our in our offices. TV
Right.
signals are coming through, FM radio, AM radio broadcast signals are coming through, wireless signals are coming through. They're all there. And there's a couple of generations, maybe 3 generations of science that's accumulated that demonstrates that this is not an issue, but it's still something that causes concern in the community. And there are often people who show up to cell tower application hearings who are unfortunately just apoplectic about the possibility of having a cell tower a quarter mile away.
Right.
Rather than having the town get into setting safety standards, Congress said, let's have the FCC establish those safety standards using an open public process and good science, and have everyone rely on the FCC standards. So what happens often in hearings is that the board chair will say, we know some of you have concerns about the emissions. We can only regulate the placement of the facility based on the FCC standards, and we have expert evidence that our expert will review to determine whether it meets the FCC standards. And some boards will just say, we can't really entertain discussion about this. Other boards will allow people to, give their concerns and their opinions, but will make it clear that they can't take those opinions into consideration.
David, in your opinion, having looked at all of this, do you think there is a danger to the general public? Maybe a long-term health effect of some kind? I'm just asking for your opinion. And
yeah, my opinion is that there is, and this is based on independent systematic reviews of the science that are ongoing, is that there is no established adverse health effect from low level radio frequency exposure like we have to our cell phones and in our homes and that sort of thing. And that's the way scientists talk, is they can't say it's safe. All they can say is that all of the evidence in front of us so far says that it's safe.
okay,
From my perspective, as somebody who's worked with radio waves for my entire career, on one hand, you could say I'm jaded, but on the other hand, I have an understanding of the physics, the physical principles that would require a radio wave to do something that would be injurious. And those physical principles are at these high levels that I encounter when I'm on a radio tower or a rooftop with a cell site antennas. They don't occur in the general environment.
okay. So just to assuage any concerns about this from the public, we put in place safeguards, and then hopefully that will take care of it for people's perceptions of what's happening.
Right. The safeguard is by congressional fiat in Telecommunications Act of 1996, is that the applicant's facility must comply with the federal safety standards.
Oh, okay, got it.
So we ask for proof of that in every application.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, David.
Yeah, I see here that we've tried to move this over to the planning board.
Yes.
Now, one thing I have just as my own personal thing is that a lot of these permit regulations have bonding requirements, removal bonds, those kinds of things. That all came from the idea that cellular was a flash in the pan and they won't need towers soon. And so we want to be sure that you can remove the tower 30 years from now when it's not needed anymore. I don't think that that's necessary because it's an administrative burden to the town to track those bonds for the next 30 years, and a regulatory burden for the applicant to have put a bond in place. And if it gets to a point where a property owner should remove a tower because it's abandoned or derelict, or a tower owner should, you have the same enforcement authority that you do for removing anything else that's no longer permitted on a property. And yeah, there could be some cost to that, but it's really low risk. So this is just my own personal predilection. I recommend avoiding bonds if the town is comfortable with what I've just described. Yep.
Are you saying that basically, like, if the tower isn't needed anymore, it falls on the burden of the landowner?
Well, yeah, what happens is that the permit, this is a little weird with wireless, but the permit technically goes with the land. And the permit can have conditions in it that say, if this tower is unused for 6 months or a year, it needs to be removed. Now, if at that point, the wireless companies or the tower owner are nowhere to be seen, the burden falls on the property owner to remove it if it's required to be removed. And that's true whether it's a gas station or a cell tower. That stuff needs to be covered by the property owner. I haven't seen any issues with towers needing to be removed, and I've never seen a bond activated for this purpose in the 30 years I've been doing this.
Good to know.
And then there's this other thing here, this thing called eligible facilities requests that the FCC in its what's called Section 6409 of the 2012 Middle Class Tax Relief and Jobs Creation Act. Set up these rules that allow people who have an existing tower to modify them up to a certain extent. And the local zoning may not deny and shall approve that modification. So if the modification is substantial, it can go through the regular permit process. If the modification is not substantial, it's what's called an eligible facilities request. Then in 2014, the FCC went and interpreted the law from Congress and applied some pretty random criteria. You can increase the height of your tower by up to 20 feet from its permitted height. If you need to add antennas higher up on the tower. You can increase the breadth of the antenna installation by up to 20 feet, which is just nonsense.
It's huge.
Yeah, it's just crazy, but it's because they took it from a historic preservation agreement that was settled in like 1999, when all we were looking at was 200, 300-foot tall cell towers, not these 100-foot tall things that are in, 120-foot tall things that are in our neighborhoods now. But the FCC went and used those criteria. Now, they do allow for the fact that if you have camouflage, you have some kind of stealthing of your tower in the approval, that modification, while it might meet the dimensional requirements, may not defeat the purpose of the concealment, the stealthing. So for instance, if you have a pole, it looks like a fat flagpole with antennas inside it. Obviously, you can't make that 20 feet wider and preserve the integrity of the concealment. So what boards often do is, when they make a decision, they say, we don't really want this thing to be 20 feet higher any time in its life. We have given it the maximum height that we're willing to give it in this neighborhood. So we're going to do something in our decision and our conditions that reinforces the fact that the height we've chosen is in fact a part of its concealment. That hasn't been tested in court yet, but boards look for ways when they write their decisions to prevent future expansion of towers that are in sensitive locations.
May I ask a question on that?
Yes, please.
So if, if a provider, an applicant were to then appeal that, saying that there's a gap in coverage that can only be solved by adding 20 feet in the height to this, where would that go?
That would be a separate application in the sense that that's not taking advantage of the may not deny and shall approve a substantial modification or an eligible facilities request.
Right.
That invokes the Telecommunications Act, which requires a permit application. It's basically the eligible facilities request gives them additional rights to expand an existing facility over and above the Telecommunications Act protections of a prohibition of provision of service, if that makes any sense.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So, what would happen is probably not an existing tenant, but a new carrier would come in and say, I can't go at 70 feet on this tower. It's in the trees. I need to be on this tower, but it needs to be taller to accommodate me. And then the tower owner would come in and say, well, I can increase the height of the tower by 20 feet and put this new tenant on the tower, and you can't do anything about it. And then you look at the permit, and if the permit says, well, we limited it to 100 feet or whatever the height of the tower is, because its visual impact is significant above 100 feet. Therefore, it's not an eligible facilities request. It gets fairly complicated. So the lesson from that is that in the writing of a decision, and perhaps even for the hearing of an application that might invoke eligible facilities requests, it's really good to have advice of counsel and technical advice to help you negotiate it and to write a decision that's solid, or as solid as possible under the circumstances.
Right, no, absolutely.
In our area where we're experiencing cell gaps and lack of service, in your opinion, not in the right of way, but in places where a tower is needed, what do you think the height of that would be?
That is so, yeah, it's so location specific, terrain specific, existing coverage specific that's hard to say. I mean, generally, we're not seeing carriers coming in eastern Massachusetts and putting in 160-foot cell towers anymore. There are in fact some towers that were originally that height, 160, 180, along, for instance, I-93 in Burlington, and the top slot or the top two slots where antennas used to be on the towers are empty. The carriers have ratcheted their equipment down. So what we might tend to see are towers in the 100 to 130 foot height range, because they have smaller service areas.
Are you familiar with the tower in Needham? You can see from 128.
There are 4 TV broadcast towers in Needham. Is that what we're talking about? The red and white ones?
There's one that has the most on it. I can't remember exactly where it is, but you can see it on 128. BUR broadcasted from there. And there were others, maybe 10 other stations broadcasting from there. But is it height specific to how high up do you have to go? In other words, how many can you fit on a tower? And it's helpful to put more on so that you don't disrupt another area.
That's, yeah, that's very important. So the red and white towers in Needham
Yeah,
on either side of Route 128
Right.
have TV and FM broadcast on them. They're
Right.
1,200 feet tall. They're
Wow.
huge. And the reason is that those TV and radio stations need to cover metropolitan Boston. They need to cover a like 35-mile radius or more. So they're way high up. The cell sites, because they have a cell site every whatever mile, every 2 miles, every half mile in densely developed areas. And a cell site might not be on a tower, it might be on a tall building or something. But when you have cell sites like that, they need to serve small air coverage areas. And you're right, if they're too high, they're throwing their signal out and it will interfere with another one of their own cell sites using the same channel.
Interesting, yeah.
So they do try to keep them down. And as I say, the heights are getting down into the low 100s of feet these days. But you brought up another important issue, and that is what in planning circles we used to call co-location, I now call site sharing, because FCC has a different definition of co-location. Site sharing is to reduce the need for multiple towers in the same general area. So if you can get T-Mobile, AT&T, and Verizon all on one pole,
Right.
great. That's just one pole in that neighborhood instead of 3. On the other hand, there are situations where it might be less objectionable visually to have, like on a ridge line, poles that are at or barely above the tree line. So there are circumstances where having multiple poles may be better than having one big, tall standout pole with 3 or 4 wireless carriers on it. Each one of them takes about a 10-foot space.
Because below the tree line, is that what you're talking about? I mean, why can you have more?
Well, as you make the tower taller, you can add 10-foot spaces to add more wireless carriers.
Okay.
But if you can visualize, for instance, a place where you perhaps have a skyline view of a tree line on a ridge or something like that, and you have a tower that's twice as high as the trees, that sticks out like a sore thumb, and that's a scenic view and you don't like it. That's an opportunity to have a tower that's just above the tree line, maybe camouflaged as a tree so you can't see it. And maybe have only 1 or 2 carriers instead of making it something that can handle 4 wireless carriers.
Well,
So
would that be something appropriate for Newbury?
it depends on sight lines, depends on where you are and where the tower is going to go and whether it's affecting a a rural scenic kind of a view.
Exactly. That's a big deal here.
Right. So one of the things that I try to do when I adjust bylaws is to not put the site sharing requirement above the visual impact requirement. In some bylaws, it's like, you're going to make that tower hold as many carriers as possible. And the applicant comes in and says, well, I need 4 carriers, so it needs to be a 140-foot tower. And as long as the bylaw says, well, yeah, but we think sometimes it's okay to have fewer carriers on the tower and have the tower be shorter if that reduces its visual impact significantly.
Right.
So we try to get that wording structured in such a way that you can make that decision as a board in reviewing the application.
Okay, that's important.
Right.
Thank
Rather
you.
than having the carrier, just the carrier or the tower company, as it may be, simply point to a clause in your bylaw that says, I need 140 feet. I need to hit 4 carriers. I need to maximize use of the tower. So we look for that kind of thing in tweaking the language on this.
Good, thanks.
Any other thoughts, questions?
So a couple questions that came up at our first meeting of the work group. I did go through the bylaw very, very quickly, not nearly as well as you've just done. And also the maps that were done of the coverage through town when you did the
Right.
drive-through.
Right.
And there were a couple of questions that came out of that first meeting. One was in regard to the draft that we have right now. Are there any changes that you would recommend based on either changes in technology since we first did this, or any changes that have sort of come about because more and more people are working from home now because of the pandemic and in general, and more demand on cell service? Or do you think that what we have pretty well covers?
Yeah, I think since the time that we did some editing of this way back when, there hasn't been that much of a shift in technology or the way they're deploying things. Other than I would have to remind myself what we're doing about small wireless facilities, but I think mostly that's something that wants to be in the under the purview of the Board of Selectmen. But like the town of Burlington, you might want to have a small wireless facility clause, and I don't think I proposed one. So maybe that's something we can.
Is that the design criteria that you spoke of?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Is that the design criteria that you spoke of?
Yes, it's the fact that someone applying to put a small wireless facility on a utility pole in a public way would go to the Board of Selectmen. And that would be a grant of location type of process. And someone installing a small wireless facility on private property would still be under zoning. And we'd want to be sure that our zoning rubric addresses small wireless facilities, because they enjoy certain privileges over and above a regular cell site. It's more permissive to put those in, so you have less control. And it would be good to have that in the bylaws. Yeah, I don't think I touched on that on this one. So it was a good question that maybe we should. I can pull up some language and propose it for this, for small wireless facilities.
Okay, so yeah, I don't think we did include that last time. So basically, would then small wireless facilities kind of show up in two locations? One is within the zoning rubric and the other would be in grant of location?
Right, so the select board would adopt a policy or a regulation.
Right. So would there be some sort of a cross-reference if we talk about it here in the bylaw, then a reference to, any small facilities that are going to be placed on town-owned property or within the right-of-way would be, in the select board's purview?
Town-owned property can stay with zoning if the town wants to do that.
Okay, so it's really right-of-way utility poles.
Yeah, the right-of-way is where the select board has authority as the owner of the public way. Obviously, the select board has authority as a landlord on town property. And the landlord's rights are different than the town zoning rights. A landlord can say no to a cell tower, behind a whatever at the landfill. So the town can say no to a cell tower on any of its properties. If it's intending to say consider having cell towers on any of the town properties, it would be good to go through a process of, for instance, adding them to the overlay district, so that they've been cleared for towers from a regulatory sense, so that the folks who come into town looking for a site for a cell tower, first thing they do is they read the bylaw, and the bylaw tells them what the town's preferences are. So that's something we can look at with that coverage assessment that we did. Are there properties that town owns that we should add to the overlay district because they have two characteristics. One is they're potentially beneficial to wireless companies for filling gaps in town. And the second is that they're potentially least obtrusive, you know, that the property is big enough or it's wooded enough or, you know, whatever, that putting a cell tower on that piece of town property is a better idea than putting it on a neighbor's private property from a visual impact standpoint.
David, is there any such thing in this case of, say, safety, where someone needs a cell phone who's in a rural area and might need help? Is there any such thing as eminent domain?
Oh, there's an approach. I haven't seen eminent domain with cell sites because the wireless companies tend to drive it.
I mean, it's just it's
Yeah.
crazy, because if somebody really had to get help and they were in an area that didn't have good cell service or spotty or whatever, could the town then say, you know, we've got to do this for these people? It's just a health matter, a safety matter.
Yeah, public safety matter. That's been used as a rationale for approving a private cell site or a cell tower. Certainly, you know, we have to put up with this because we don't have any coverage over here and it's not safe. So that's, you know, one of the things you look at. The purpose and intent of the bylaw is public welfare. So, you know, that's good. The difficulty is, and this has always been a problem, is that, you know, a town will say, I've got a real big gap over here and our residents don't like it and our public safety people don't like it. And you can't force a wireless carrier to build a facility where it doesn't plan to build a facility.
Okay.
They
They drive the process. They basically drive the process.
right.
Okay. Okay. Always gets back to the money.
Yeah, I was just looking to see whether I had, if you think there's any benefit, Martha, in talking about, going back and talking about those coverage maps briefly.
Well, those are really helpful to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, we could certainly do that. I know that we had identified a couple of locations. One was the DPW barn on High Road, and that's a small property, so that's kind of problematic for a tower, I think. We had also talked possibly about Triton, but it might be helpful. Before we go on to that, though, just in terms of the document that we have in front of us, then it looks like adding provisions regarding small wireless facilities is one thing. There were some definitions that you noted at the end need to be added.
Right.
And the section on eligible facilities, which you said needed to be sort of reviewed and possibly modified. Anything else you can think of?
Yeah, I like to think that I got all of the nitpicky little kind of editorial and positioning, language positioning things taken care of with these edits. So yeah, I think that's pardon me for making you seasick here. That's yeah, those are the blocks I think we can touch up.
Great, thank you.
Should we do the maps? Martha, is that okay?
Yeah, sure. David, do you have them, or do you want me to try to find them and pull them up?
I was just found the folder that I had them in. Let me just see here. So we have estimated existing low band coverage. And I have a January drive test.
Martha, can I ask whether or not others, the other guys want to look at the maps? I mean, I don't want to be the one to request it if others don't have an interest. The other guys, Woody, Leslie.
No, it'd be nice to refresh our memories.
Leslie?
Yeah, I'm good to go with that. Like
Okay.
to look at the maps.
Well, we can probably move pretty quickly. So this is we mounted phones on the inside of the windshield on the dashboard and collected data on their current service, which is their 4G LTE technology. And these represent signal strengths. The blue stuff is not great. It's the kind of thing that they would want to improve. This is from an AT&T phone.
Okay, we're still seeing the bylaw. I don't know if you.
Oh, I didn't. Yeah, I'm sorry. Thank you.
That's right. They're all-
Stop share. Thanks for pointing that out.
Sorry.
I thought I was sharing my screen, but I was sharing my my window, wasn't I? Okay, let's try this one. Close that and what do you see now? Anything different?
Yeah, we're seeing the T-Mobile drive test, January 2020.
Okay, great. Let me go back to start with AT&T. So like I said, the blue stuff is not great. It works. If you're outside and you need to make a phone call, you should be able to make a phone call. But if you're trying to do video streaming, podcast listening, you're in an area where there are a lot of people trying to use the network at the same time, those kind of things, now your performance is going to diminish. That's what the carriers are trying to do now, is to provide that expected quality of service where people tend to be, which includes in their residences. So here's T-Mobile. It's not quite as good as AT&T, probably because their antennas might be lower. I'm going to jump back. You see the green areas, and you can expect that near the center of a green area is where they have a cell site. Over here, up here somewhere. We'll see on another map where the cell sites are. So if we jump to AT&T, the green areas are pretty much the same. It's just AT&T has better coverage, so they probably have higher antennas at one of the locations. And then Verizon is similar. Its gaps are in slightly different locations, but generally we can see where there isn't coverage. Over here, there's issues. Over here, there's issues. And for Verizon, they're not doing very well along the waterfront. Let's look at the waterfront for a second with T-Mobile and with AT&T. So, what happens out here where you're in, coastal dune and marshland and that kind of thing, where there isn't much in the way of trees, signals coming from pretty long distances and maybe from well off this map up and down the coast are coming in and providing a modicum of service. But when you have lots of people crowded at a beach, and they're all trying to reach that distant cell site that's already being overloaded by other people at the beach further up the coast, carriers tend to want to add facilities in order to pull that traffic off the other cell site to reduce the burden. And that's what's referred to as a capacity problem. It's less a coverage issue than a capacity issue. So those are the three drive tests. Let's look at coverage. Just a quick side trip. The other thing that happens here is that the carriers are providing coverage on multiple frequency bands. So they have two frequency bands delivering their fourth generation 4G LTE signals. One is a much higher frequency that doesn't cover as well as the low band that we're showing coverage from here. And what that means is that it's helpful to put a cell tower close to where there's development or where there's a lot of activity, whether it's a beach or a dense residential area or a busy commercial district. Because when you put the cell tower way out in the woods, the high band is providing service to the woods, which nobody's using, and the low band's doing all the work addressing the subscribers in the periphery. So it is beneficial to try to get cell towers nestled right into residential areas. If you can find a large parcel, maybe wooded, or that's not in residential use, like town properties and those kind of things, to put a cell tower. So here we've got, actually we've identified the locations of existing cell sites. And I think there's a couple of different ones here by the state police. And there's one down here in Raleigh. So this is what the computer model says is the predicted coverage. And a computer has to make certain assumptions in order to predict coverage. So green is equivalent to yellow. Green from the computer model is equivalent to yellow on the drive test model. So there's some correlation there between the computer prediction and the actual measurements of the drive test. And what we did here was we just did the one, we used AT&T as the kind of the reference because it had pretty good service. And we can see where there are, there's a pretty big gap down here. We don't really need to serve marshes, but we'd like to get the roads going across the marshes. And so there could be an issue in the future with companies wanting to put small cells on utility poles along here, along the waterfront.
Yep, that's actually come up. Verizon wanted to do, put one on the utility pole right at Plum Island Center.
Mm-hmm.
But it didn't really fall within our bylaw right now because we don't really have provisions for that. And there was, going back to the question about safety, there was a huge outcry from people concerned about,
Right.
Impact of the radio waves.
Yep. And yeah, as they get closer to people's residences, people get more concerned. The thing is they have smaller coverage footprints, so they put out less power because they don't need to reach as far. Yeah, was that on? That was like on town property or private property?
It was basically, it's in the, it was right in the parking lot at the center. So it's town property.
You're right. So it was not on the public way where all they have to do is make an agreement with the utility. And then they would come to the Board of Selectmen for approval under a grant of location permit.
Right. They actually went before the ZBA, or they're trying to figure out how to, how to make it work. And it's essentially the parking lot is the end of Plum Island Boulevard.
Yeah, I think I recall seeing that. So what that meant is that because it's on private property, it's subject to zoning. It would be subject to the current wireless bylaw. And it's a question of whether the bylaw, as written today, as it is currently in force, would have prohibited that, and whether they would have needed a variance to do it. And that gets back to what I was talking about earlier on, the difference between regulating a cell tower and regulating wireless facilities in general. It's a really good idea to encourage people to put a small wireless facility in a cupola on the peaked roof of a building in an area with dense development, or on utility poles, so that you don't get the cell towers. And that's the positive side of small wireless facility technology. That it will help provide coverage and reduce the number of new cell towers needed. So yeah, let's look at, we turned on a tower at Triton location and at the DPW location. And we picked a height that was above tree height, but not a real dominant height for a tower. And these can actually be poles. When I say tower, anything that's built specifically for the purpose of supporting antennas is an antenna tower. But it could be as you're familiar with the monopole tower, where it's tubular. Carriers are leaning away from doing the flagpole style tower where you can't see the antennas, because they have so much equipment they put on the tower now. It's hard to fit that inside the canister. So I think if you go down to, I don't know, you might have one, but I know in Rowley, there's at least one flagpole style cell tower. But those are hard to convince carriers to do these days.
You mean
So-
like the, oh, I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
like the Unipole on Route 1, is that?
Yes,
you're
exactly. Yeah, unipole is a yeah, that's one of the terms for that type of tower.
Okay. But that
Um,
would be an example of what you're talking about for visual, for people's visual.
Well, yeah, the thing is for new towers, for one thing, carriers are doing less and less of their own new towers. They're having tower companies come in and do them. And then the tower company can lease it to other carriers, and the carrier is just hands off. The tower company's taking the risk on getting the permits. The carrier is just handing over their coverage data to show that they need it. And there, the carrier and the tower company are reluctant to do unipoles because they're less effective. They can't fit as many antennas in there. There are all kinds of radio equipment that goes inside them now that didn't used to. So they shy away from agreeing to do unipole installations these days.
Thank you.
So yeah, so what we see here is that with these two locations, and I'm trying to remember what I picked for the site at Triton, but I tried to pick a spot that was on high ground, kind of well away from the street, well away from the residences, perhaps screened a bit by existing trees. This does a substantial job providing coverage to parts that don't have strong coverage in town. I don't know what how is this largely open space, or is there residential in here?
No, that's Martin Burns Wildlife Management.
Yeah,
Area.
yeah, okay. I thought I recalled one of those. Yeah, so that's why we targeted doing this, because you need a stronger signal outside a house or outside a school in order to have a usable signal inside. So it's like I was saying, it's good to have a cell site near those kind of locations, so you get good signal to as many structures as possible. And just because this is showing as white space in the conservation area, that's not really a problem, because you're outdoors and there's still plenty of signal there for making a phone call if you need to. You twisted your ankle and you need to get medevaced from from your walk on the trails. So that's not an issue for outdoor coverage. So that's one. Another one was where I went to the site called Little Old Town. I forget what the asset is that's there.
Yeah, it's Old Town Hill, which is
Oh, the hill.
highest point in Newbury.
Right. I remember that hill. That hill was the source of a long time ago. I got involved in defending the town against the suit by T-Mobile, which wanted to put a facility, I think, a little north of it.
It was at Iron Moon Farm.
Iron Moon Farm, right? And they were showing the thing was providing coverage that I didn't think it would provide, because, or vice versa, because of the way they modeled their coverage. And I do recall dealing with the fact that this hill was blocking signal coming south and still leaving a gap down here. So if there are a way to get up on that knob with what did I do here? I did 75 feet. Basically, I did a utility pole, you know, or something that's just taller than the trees, to see what kind of coverage it could provide. And, you know, that's pretty cool. Some of that has to do with whether there's a property up there that you can effectively, if not completely conceal, at least minimize the impact of a pole up there with antennas on it. And then the other way we did it was with Triton and Plum. So here, we knowing that this is all flat and there really isn't any obstruction to the signal till you get back here where there's vegetation, you know, trees and stuff. We just wanted to see what would putting something at a 35-foot height, like on the roof of a building, would do. And, you know, it would do a great job covering all of the development that's up here, Plum Island. Down here, it's mostly outdoor stuff. So, you know, I don't think it's going to be a major issue for trying to get better coverage. And then going back to the, you know, the mainland, this is still spotty. This thing does great out of Plum Island, but it's not super at helping with the coverage in this well-developed part of town. So in a way that it looks like the DPW is the perhaps the best option, at least in terms of trying to identify sites for cell towers that the town owns and controls. We can see here that because of the hill, there's still this gap down here. But that could potentially be something that's small enough that carriers would be willing to put small cells in to address. And similarly up here, since you're on the boundary, and it's mostly development in Newburyport.
Yep.
Got it. Okay, thanks. That if a carrier is going to be trying to solve coverage issues up here, they're going to go into Newburyport, perhaps look for a rooftop or a bunch of utility poles, and that will address any overlap into the Newbury side of things.
Although we do have the First Parish Church there.
You have the church there, right? Right. We'll call that. And there's somebody in that is.
As far as I know, there aren't any carriers in there, if that's what you're
Okay.
asking.
Yeah, I guess it's just been a topic of discussion for a long time.
It
Because it's on
has.
high ground. Yeah. It would be a great place to conceal an antenna in the steeple. So
For these
Yeah.
suggested tower locations, and could you, I guess I'm wondering, could you achieve equivalent coverage if carriers were willing to come in and do small wireless facilities as opposed to towers? You know, I'm primarily concerned about the DPW
mhm.
lot, since that is very small, doesn't meet any of the setback requirements.
Well, years ago, when the first kind of small wireless facility called a distributed antenna system was the latest and greatest, that was a battle we started fighting then, and we still fight today, is that we can't really tell the carriers what approach, or as one court in New York, Clarkstown said, is that we can't dictate the quote unquote technology. So the only way we can get them to do a distributed antenna system or small cells of any kind on utility poles to serve an area is to make it really easy for them. And sometimes it's hard to do when you have a densely developed area, because they would rather have an umbrella of coverage from a cell tower and then go in and put the small cells in to add capacity at shopping centers, near a school, at major intersections. AT&T just got approval for 2 small cells on Burlington Mall Road at 2 intersections where the traffic just, at least during non-COVID times, the traffic backs up like crazy. And what they're trying to do there is not so much serve the traffic, but to get the traffic from stopping their use of a cell site that's being overloaded by everything. So this is that kind of capacity gap that carriers are now looking at rather than coverage gaps. So there's existing cell service there, but it's just low enough that it's putting undue pressure on an existing cell site. So that's the way they like to develop their small cells. And in that respect, these 2 locations or locations like them, I think would still be desirable for a tower kind of a facility.
And how would we deal with the fact that the DPW lot is so small, so it doesn't meet most of our criteria?
Yeah, exactly. Whether you keep the dimensional criteria to the variance threshold, so that you force the carrier to go to variance before going for a special permit. Yeah, that's a really tough one, because it's the whole idea of as selectively as you legally can, identifying parcels where you'll allow a cell tower is to try to identify parcels that are not obnoxious to residents. And that's why we went for a 90 feet at the DPW, just to see if we could pick something that was not so tall that it would loom over the neighboring residences.
Right.
And yeah.
Criteria, right? Martha, David,
I'm sorry?
the criteria for the DPW site.
Right. I mean, I'm thinking largely, the setbacks, because there's a fall zone and all that kind of stuff, and the tower would, automatically go outside of that. It just doesn't meet those.
Okay, I didn't know that's, okay, got it, thank you.
The DPW site's a small footprint.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's very small.
Yeah.
Other site there that would work?
I'm sorry, Mary, what?
Is there any other site other than the DPW near there that would work? If you can't put it on the DPW site, then is there an alternative nearby?
Yeah, good question.
So DPW is which one?
Uh,
I think it's right. With a one.
It's 197 High, so it's just at the intersection of High Road and Old Pine Island Road. So if you keep going down,
Oh, okay,
it
down here.
is-
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So yeah, what you would end up doing is picking a spot back here, trying to keep it, so that it's visually isolated from this property and this property, especially. And let me drop a circle. 0.01 miles. Thank you very much. Let me do feet. All right. So I have. All right. So there's a 90-foot radius. If you're really kind of constrained, but at least you can attempt to put the isolation toward the existing residences. And so then it would be a question of what a 90-foot pole or some height would look like to neighbors, depending on where you put it. Sometimes it's better to put it back here because it's nestled in among existing trees, and that gives it more cover from other points of view. Now, the way this driveway is looped and open, I think if you're over on this side of the driveway, you're probably going to see it. But it's a question of how much of this property is already visually an imposition on this property as to whether it's a major difference in impact.
Yeah, I mean, I think the trees probably cover the low level stuff.
Right.
The other consideration is making sure that it goes someplace that doesn't interfere with the DPW operations.
Of course, because it is a small parcel. Now, the other way to go is to put it out front. And in that respect, you're allowing more people to see it, but you might, because you're the property owner, you might insist that it be a unipole. And in that case, you, as a property owner, you can make that negotiation. Yeah, you can put a cell tower here, but it can only be 95 feet high, and it has to be a unipole. And that's the deal. So you'll get potentially two carriers able to use it, and other carriers may still have to find some other solution. So what we find up here on the hilltop, right, 49 feet, 88 feet elevation, 96 feet elevation, is, and this really depends on whether there are property owners who have an interest in doing this on their property, as to whether they'd be willing to have a pole that is basically just above tree height, somewhere at a remote location on their property. Diameter wise, we have similar issues that the place that you might be able to put something is limited.
David, does the property owner get paid by the carrier?
Yes.
Okay, how,
Yeah.
how does that work?
Well, the carrier or the tower company, whoever it is that's building the tower, first of all, enters into a lease, and that can be with the town. If the town, and this is what happens sometimes, is that what's called a site acquisition agent for a tower company or a carrier comes into town, reads the bylaw, looks at the properties, identifies something that might work, that might be zonable, and then enters into a lease option with the property owner. So that could be with the town. I have a tower that's been there for 20 years in town of Dover next to me that we arranged for an RFP because we knew there were carriers interested in putting a tower in the center of town, and townsfolk were agreeable mostly to the idea of putting it on the Dover DPW site, which is also a long, narrow site with residences on some abutting properties. And so that was a lease between the tower owner and the town. And so the town got whatever the current lease amount is, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year for a land lease for a footprint to put the tower and a fenced compound for the wireless companies. So a private property owner would do the same thing. The private property owner would have a knock on the door or a letter in the mail, and they'd have a conversation about whether they want to earn some money and have a cell tower somewhere, if possible, remotely located on their property. It's funny how landowners tend to not want to have to look at the tower, but don't mind if the neighbors do.
Yeah, as long as it involves money. Also, you don't want somebody knocking at your door and asking if you want to make some money. It's like, who are you again?
Right, and these guys, these are real estate professionals, so they know how to approach people and with an offer they can't refuse, with the best possible.
Just a wireless joke.
means.
A wireless site tip. Anyway, well, that's kind of cool to know that. I mean, that would be of interest to me if I were out in the audience.
Well, and that's tends to be what happens is that they'll identify an area and they'll go to a bunch of property owners and they'll find a property or multiple properties that look like they're zonable in terms of setbacks and visual impact and that sort of thing. And then they'll go to the lowest bidder.
Right.
So if you know that the market rate is, $34,000 a year, and you say, yeah, I'll do market rate, and your neighbor doesn't know that and accepts $18,000 a year, that's where the application's going to go.
That's awesome. Okay, got it.
So that's the.
What is the going rate right now for?
Yeah, well, as I say, it really depends. I see initial offers coming in the 24,000 range. And this is for private properties in more rural residential kinds of areas. But going rate tends to be about 36,000 a year. For carriers are willing to pay a little bit more to towns because they know they're going to get if they have a lease with the town, they're going to get more favorable attention from the zoning process. Not always, but
Yeah, sure, makes sense.
so they do tend to pay a premium. We just renegotiated leases, rebid them for the Dover Tower for another 20 years. And those, we had a minimum bid of 55,000 a year. But that's because those leases were started 20 years ago and have been escalating. And they were up at the like $70,000 range. And we did a market assessment. And we said, well, in order to keep these guys for another 20 years, let's pull the rate back, and then we can let the escalate the rate from there. So that's why they went for a minimum of $55,000.
Interesting. Martha, do we have just curious, do we have a time limit on this meeting?
I think
didn't see anything, so.
Good point.
there is no time limit. I think I would leave it to all of you, especially David, since
I have a 3 o'clock, so that's my time limit. But, good question. So in terms of next steps, what we've got these couple of bullet items for tweaking the draft, which I'll get on and send back to Martha. Some of this is process. It's deciding how to, if we think we want to suggest having a town discussion about adding the DPW site and Triton to the overlay district, how we would go about doing that. And if that's a direction we want to go, I can produce some using this Google Earth stuff with the property lines that I have and other things, I can illustrate what we're talking about in terms of possible location for a pole. It's a little more involved to actually do a balloon test and then develop photo simulations, but we can do that too. 20 years ago, I did that in Dover. We balloon tested 3 locations on the DPW property and allowed people to view it from their backyards and the street and that sort of thing, and then pick the best location on the property for visual impact.
David, how does Newbury compare to other towns in terms of quality of coverage?
What I'm looking at here reminds me of my own town, Medfield. Although we have even fewer wireless facilities. We have antennas on the water tank, which is 3/4 of a mile outside the center of town. That does okay in the center of town. We have a cell tower in our industrial extensive district down by the Charles River. Everybody's on that one. That covers a part of town. We have just a couple of years ago acquired the water tank at the Medfield State Hospital on the hill in another part of town. We replaced the water tank, built it so that we could put antennas on it. 2 carriers have antennas on that, but we've got these other spots in town that are like what you're experiencing, where we're getting coverage dribbling in from a neighboring town that it's only coverage because the Charles River floodplain is there and the tower's pretty far away, but signal kind of dribbles in and it sort of works, but it's not really good. So a lot of towns are like that. It's different when you get to towns that are much more densely developed, whether you're talking about Stoneham or Lynn or places like that, where they're using lots of building rooftops and they have their share of cell towers as well to get pretty good coverage over most of the town.
Thank you.
Guess one of the questions I have is whether it would make sense to kind of do this as a 2-step process. Talking about expanding the overlay district, for example, that could be, that could be a conversation that could go on for a while. There is some, eagerness to get revisions in place. I'm just kind of wondering whether we should make the revisions that we've talked about now and then possibly come back and look at expanding the overlay district for a future town meeting.
Yep, I agree.
I would agree with that.
I do too.
And then, perhaps by adding the small wireless facilities and things like that, that begins to open things up to carriers if they want to pursue that route. But given the time frame that we're dealing with, trying to get this ready for Springtown meeting and presenting something to the select board in early February, I'm concerned about trying to actually add other sites to our overlay district right now without really vetting them.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good way to kind of keep your powder dry. Get the bylaw changes, which are really needed to help protect the town in the current state of affairs, and then do a more involved process to vet new sites for the overlay district. That works. All right. So just real quick, I just went to the Dover DPW site where the tower is, and there's one neighbor who has the tower out their backyard, but they also have a pretty clear view of this is a little bit higher ground, pretty clear view of the building and the trucks that come and go back here and the mounds of material when they pile up mulch and that sort of thing. So they weren't happy when it happened, but it was kind of a necessary evil in order to otherwise hide this thing from the center of town. All right,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. So with that.
Yep, no, interesting that it's, sort of similar dimensional issues there.
Yeah.
So, well, this was great. Thank you so much. Does anybody have any other questions right now for David?
No.
I don't.
I have one. Is there anything, with 5G technology coming in, is there anything, does the bylaw with the suggested revisions cover that, or are we looking at a whole other round of stuff?
Yeah, 5G is in a way a non-event. It's just better 4G. But people have found all these things that 5G does that are different from 4G. So it's become this big monster. 5G, what they're doing is they're putting 5G onto the former 3G facilities at their cell sites. they're turning off 3G and they're turning on 5G, and 4G is there providing the basic service. So there's things that they can do with 5G, that they can move data faster, they can have multiple people using the same channel at the same instant. There's a bunch of ways to make the use of the spectrum more efficient. That is part of 5G. The other part of 5G that people are making hay out of is the fact that 5G can use all of the existing channels that 3G and 4G use. Simply by turning off 3G and putting 5G on them. But they can also use higher frequency channels that don't go very far, but have tremendous capacity. So what we're seeing in more densely developed areas, the urban areas, and in fact, AT&T is doing this at their 2 small cell sites on Burlington Mall Road, is they're also putting in what are called millimeter wave radios. They operate with these very short wavelengths and very small antennas. And that enables them to do much higher capacity for a very small coverage footprint. So they really need to be where there's a high density of users. But people have just made this big hue and cry about millimeter waves and how it's a big test on the public. But in fact, millimeter waves have been used for decades. They've been studied for health impacts and risks and all of those things. And they're covered by the FCC safety standards. So you know, from my perspective, and as I say, you can blame me for being jaded. I've worked in the industry for a long time. People are making a mountain out of a molehill with that one distinction about 5G technology. So small cells are necessary for 5G to use these frequencies. So that's just another reason why you might see more small cell applications near your shopping districts and your areas where people congregate for sports and those kinds of things.
Okay, but there's no additional provisions or nothing else that we need to change in terms of.
No, I don't think so. I think as long as we pull in some small cell language, we're good.
That should take care of it. Great. So I don't want to put you on the spot, but in terms of timing and picking up the things that we talked about today, what do you think would be possible at your end?
July 5th? I'm kidding, just kidding. Yeah, what do we need to stay on track?
No, we don't need to have it finalized by February. Well, I've been told that this needs to get to the select board in time for their February 8th meeting, I think. It doesn't need to be finalized by then, but we need to have a decent draft. And quite honestly, I don't know how you guys all feel, but I'd feel pretty comfortable providing them the draft that we have to say this is the direction that we're going in. If
I
there's
agree, Martha, it's going to be a lot to digest at a meeting. So
Right.
at least give them a little bit of a heads up and.
right, I mean, what we will have to do to keep to our schedule, we'll need to hold the public hearing on this in March. So we'll definitely need to have, have the draft language finalized by then. The board will have to vote, I think, kind of contingent on having the select board refer it back to us for a public hearing. I think the board is actually going to have to vote on that date at our first meeting in February. And it would be good to have the draft language finalized by the time we need to post the public hearing notice. So David, I can send you all of those dates if that would be helpful.
Sure. Just assuming I'm in the correct week here. Yeah, I think if we talk about having something by February 1st, I'm just looking at, I usually jump right on these things because they're fresh in my mind, and I will probably do that. I have a
Right.
couple other things that I'm jumping on that are fresh in my mind as well. So if sometime between now and February 1st, I will get to you the next markup, the next revisions that we've talked about, if that works.
Yeah, I think that would work fine. Our first meeting in February is the 2nd, so that's when we would be setting our public hearing date, probably contingent, as I said, on the select board referring this back to us for public hearing. So I think getting it to us by the 2nd so that we could review it and then send that on to the select board. I think that would be helpful. We'll also want to have town council review it,
Right.
Which is our standard practice.
And just one other thing that somebody's remark about how, well, my word, daunting going over something like this in a public meeting can be. I think when I get my head back into it as I'm doing these revisions, perhaps I can put together a bullet list of the kind of the objectives of the different things that we've done to modify it, to explain it rather than, in a page, rather than have people try to read it and figure out what we're talking about.
Right, that would be great. And that's usually when I when I submit things to the select board, that's usually what I do, is try to, do the kind of a bullet point so that they understand what the purpose is.
Right. Okay.
Sounds good.
All right.
So can I just ask Woody one question? And that stuff on the wall behind you, is that like laser cut metal or what is that?
They're old stencils
Oh, the
from-
stencils. Okay. Yeah.
from packaging vegetables.
Awesome. Oh, great.
Wow.
Potatoes and everything.
How old are those?
Oh, over 100 years or more old.
Man, very cool. I would never have guessed.
No, me either.
They,
Some
you
kind
know,
of
like
rivet.
trying to read them backwards here, but like russets and Baldwin potatoes. And
Yeah.
they were stuff from packaging produce from my family.
Cool. So that's what you'd find stenciled on a wooden box crate.
Yeah, the old barrel or crate, yeah,
Uh-huh.
Very
or
cool.
the cover of a bushel basket.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah, very cool.
Right. Thanks for that quick side trip.
They it's a way to display them, and they're not worth anything really, but they're a way to display them and not have them get ruined. They hang.
Oh,
hanging
no.
in.
That's great fun.
Yeah, if they make you happy, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, something to look at. They'll look that great.
Yeah, it's neat. Really neat.
Now that I know what they are.
Can I borrow a couple to stencil something?
I want the broccoli one.
You gonna start packing potatoes, Leslie?
Yams.
Come across old crates all the time that don't have anything on them, and it would be just like a fun project to do.
Really cool.
They they used to use the brush and
Mhm.
brush the letters.
What did they use? What kind of- Strictly, I'm curious. You know?
Say that again?
Ink. What did they use for the
I have no idea.
Depending on what, for stenciling, depending on what you're stenciling on, there's different products that you can use. But most of them, you want them to be resistant to water.
Sure, absolutely.
So I know David has a 3 o'clock, so we should probably
Yeah.
at least let him go and get ready for that. But really
Thank you
appreciate,
so much for helping us out today.
yeah, that
Well,
was,
Thank you, David.
I think you've done all good questions. So I like working for a group that's plugged in to discussing the issues. Appreciate that. Thank you.
well, we certainly appreciate your guidance on this. So I think we've got a plan, and unless there are any other questions, I guess we could have a motion and a second to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second,
All right, and I guess we need to do a roll call vote. I'm not sure we need to discuss it,
Yeah.
but Leslie,
Yes.
Woody,
Yes.
Mary,
Yes.
and I'm not a voting member, but I'll say yes anyway. So, great. Well,
Okay,
thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks,
again.
David. Thanks, Martha. See you
Thanks.
guys.
Have a good day, everyone.
Yeah,
Very good.
thanks, you too. So we'll report on this at next Wednesday's meeting.
Very
Okay.
good.
Okay,
Yeah, I think it was very productive. So thank you all.
Yes,
Yep.
thank you.
have a good day.
Thanks, you too.